Well, hello and welcome to Fountain Springs. My name is Nicholas. Just so glad that you're with us today. If you're joining us at East or online or even on television, thank you for being with us. It's so good to see your faces. How many of you have ever had a friend who struggles with anxiety or depression or maybe some other type of mental health condition? Not you, of course, but maybe someone you know. You nod your head, this means yes. Today I want to talk about some of those things. I want to talk about mental health, but I want to talk about a lot more than just mental health. And I want to acknowledge here at the beginning just a couple things. One, that I'm a pastor. I am not a mental health professional. I cannot diagnose you. Maybe some of you I can. Maybe it'd be really obvious. But I am a pastor. At the same time, I believe that faith in God has a very important role to play in how we handle conditions like anxiety or depression. And I think everyone benefits from understanding how God created them. I think we benefit from walking in the way of Christianity as we try to navigate these things. But I also recognize that sometimes faith in God is not enough. And I'm just so grateful for the many mental health professionals that are a part of this church, that are a part of our community, especially those who are guiding people and teaching people from a bit of a Christian background. I'm just so grateful for you, so thank you. Can we agree that any conversation about anxiety or depression or mental health conditions is a delicate conversation? And maybe that the church hasn't always been on the front lines of these conversations. In fact, maybe it'd be fair to say that this entire discussion about what's happening inside the human brain is relatively new in the scope of the existence of humanity. It's only been the last several decades that we've begun to understand what these conditions are. And it wasn't uncommon in the past to attribute disorders like bipolar or something similar, schizophrenia, to demon possession, or we really just had no clue what was happening. And now we're all starting to understand this, but I think it would be wise for all of us just to remember, let's be gentle with these conversations and careful with the kinds of language we use because they are so difficult. And as we begin, what I'd like to do is kind of just establish a few thoughts that I'm operating on, things that I think will help serve as guardrails when we discuss anxiety or depression or things like that. So the first thing I would like to say, I think, is something like this: mental health conditions are not sinful. This may seem obvious, but maybe all of these will seem like an oversimplification, but it hasn't always been the case that we knew this to be true. And I think maybe some of you need to hear that if you're wrestling with depression or if you're wrestling with some other things, those conditions are not sinful. Now, maybe the way that you respond to them or the way that you act on them can become sinful, but it's worth noting, at least in the beginning, that these are not sins. The second thing I would say is God does not want you to suffer. Your mental health struggles may be the result of the consequences of sin, either through trauma that maybe you created in your own life or that someone else did that was sinful behavior. It may be entirely genetic and hereditary, but I think it's important for us to establish that these are natural consequences, not divine punishment. Maybe you need to hear God is not trying to damage your mind. The third thing I would say is sometimes mental health is biological, that it involves the makeup of the chemical composition in your brains, which is why at times medication is the best necessary treatment for some of our mental illnesses. And then last, I would say sometimes, let me step out of the way, mental health is environmental. And what I mean by that is that sometimes our mental health conditions are the result of things that are happening around us or the way that we are operating in the world that exists around us. And I think I'd like to spend most of my time trying to pull that last idea apart right there. That what does it look like for us to live in a world that maybe isn't supportive of our mental health, right? It's not making it better. So in 2 Corinthians, Paul says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone and the new is here. What does it mean to be made new? What does Paul have in mind here? Well, it's new, but it's also kind of old, because I think what he's suggesting is it's a return to an original intent that God had for humanity. When we were designed, we were intended to live and to operate and to function a certain way, but it was lost in the garden, right? And we're trying to claim some of that back. Friends, you don't need me to tell you that something has gone terribly wrong in the process. Our mental health problems are more than mental health problems. We've lost sight of the whole person that God has created us to be. Maybe this Venn diagram would help. We are physical and mental and emotional beings. We're at least these three things. And when they're working together, they form like the spiritual center of our being. And when any of these areas are dysfunctional, it's only a matter of time before they affect the other areas of who we are. So I want to have a conversation about mental health, but also about physical health and emotional health and how that is eradicating our spiritual health. There is a pastor and author, I think from Australia, maybe New Zealand, he would probably hate that I said that, but named Michael Frost, who wrote a book called Excarnation. And it is a book that examines, sort of like pulls back the curtain on just how dysfunctional life has gotten in the late 20th century and early 21st century. We have more blessing and favor than any generation that has gone before us, and somehow we've become the least contented with it. In terms of wars, like random occurrences of violence, life expectancy, we should be living the least trauma-impacted lives of any humans who've ever existed on the planet, and yet, you know the numbers that I know, anxiety and depression and other mental health conditions statistically are skyrocketing, and it started long before a pandemic showed up. We're losing control of ourselves, and in Excarnation, Michael Frost says he can identify at least three reasons why this might be happening. The first thing he says is, we are living physically disembodied lives. We are losing touch with our actual bodies. We're becoming excarnated. Excarnation is an Old English term, and it means like to deflesh the bones from the body tissue, right? It's the opposite of incarnation. It's taking flesh off the bone. A butcher excarnates the bone from the body. Apparently, it originates in ancient English days. In Old England, English kings would take their armies into battle on foreign lands. And if the king died in battle, the army couldn't risk carrying around a slowly decomposing corpse, right, because of disease and infection and all kinds of other things. But they also couldn't leave his body lying on a foreign battlefield. And so what they would do is they would excarnate the king's bones from his body, carry them with him, and then when the army returned from war, his body would receive a proper royal burial. There's even a Scottish legend of a community near the Island Rock area that, again, like out of fear and an abundance of caution for disease and sickness, when people in their community died, they would lay their bodies out on these large slabs of stone by the water. And day by day, birds would come. This is pretty disgusting now that I think about it. But day by day, birds would come and they would just pick the flesh off the bone until nothing remained but bones. And then the community would gather the bones and they would bury them in essuaries, bone boxes, for a proper burial. They were excarnating the body from the flesh. And the idea here is that after 500 years of Enlightenment thinking, we are experiencing a physical form of excarnation. Here's what I mean by that. Knowledge, knowing, and truth have become disembodied from our physical selves. We know things only in our minds now. A lot of it began with this guy. This is René Descartes in Cartesian thinking. He looks like he could be a musketeer, I suppose, but he was a French Catholic man who lived in the early 1600s. And he was a very devout Catholic, early on at least. But he was wrestling with all of these questions about why he exists and what the purpose of his life is and whether or not God is real. He actually wanted to pursue the priesthood. And so one day he locked himself sort of famously in his kitchen. And he wrestled with these thoughts as long as it took to find an answer. And what he arrived at was sort of like the famous Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum. He said, because I'm thinking about these things, I must therefore exist. Right? And in that moment, it lit a flame of intellectual enlightenment thinking that entirely separated knowing from the body, and it outsourced it entirely to the brain. It's all thought-based now. The problem is that for most of human history, humans have known things with their bodies, with their physical flesh. We knew things, we could feel things for many, many generations. Weather patterns were predicted, the moisture in the air was predicted by how it made your bones feel or your joints feel, right? We knew things by achy bones about the weather. We don't need to predict the weather anymore. Maybe here we do, but some of you maybe have known an older, like, woman, grandmother kind of figure who still bakes a lot of muffins or pies or biscuits or something like that. And it's not uncommon to find these people that, like, using recipes that don't call for grams or ounces. They call for, like, pinches and dashes. I had a grandmother who used to make a number of different pies for our Thanksgiving dinners back in Michigan, and she knew how much nutmeg she needed by how it felt in her hand. Her body knew. She didn't need a measuring cup, right? We used to know things in our physical bodies. In fact, the term for it was elbow learning. You learned by sitting at the elbow of the master and observing the master at work. You watched. It was more of a hands-on, trial and error approach to learning. In fact, this is the story of Stradivari violins. Stradivari musical instruments are some of the most famous and priceless musical instruments in the world. And what's most interesting about them is they've never had a blueprint. There are no measurements, there are no sizes, there are no weights. The family simply started building them. And the way they taught the next generation to do it was through elbow learning. You sat at the elbow of the master and you watched him build a violin. And if you needed to know if the neck was too thick or too long or too short or too heavy, you took it to the master and he would just hold it. His hands knew, his body knew something. It's the difference between academy-style learning and apprenticeship-style learning. In the academy, everything happens in our mind, but the apprenticeship involves sort of like this coming together of mind and body. We often talk in churches about the incarnation of Jesus, that when Jesus is born, he is God becoming human flesh. It's the opposite of defleshing, it's enfleshing. And the idea is that we, in a similar way, are made in the image of God, not just in a like unseen metaphysical spiritual way, but in an actual body sense. Our bodies have a way of knowing truth that is unavailable to our minds. Let me say that again. Our bodies have a way of knowing truth that is unavailable to our minds. We sense things. We have instincts. Our bodies know things. So maybe when Paul asks in 1 Corinthians 6, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? What he means to say, at least in part, is that our bodies know things. And what if one dimension of the incarnation, at least one dimension of the incarnation, is that our bodies contain divine DNA? And what if living like Jesus actually begins to like reprogram our minds to think like Jesus? What if doing the things that Jesus did would actually allow you to think the things that Jesus thought? What if it actually is easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way into a new way of acting? Our bodies know things, but we're losing touch with it. But we're not just living physically disembodied lives. We're living socially dislocated lives. We're losing meaningful connection with our communities. We're extracting ourselves from our hometowns, from our family relationships. Richard Sennett is a professor of sociology in London, and he says, maybe life in the 21st century, we're living a lot like the way that people spend time in an airport gate lounge. What is life like at an airport gate? It's a whole lot of fun, isn't it? It's like dull and sterile and isolated. It's liminal. You're no longer where you used to be. You're not home. You're gone, right? Especially once you go through TSA. You're no longer where you used to be, but you're not yet where you're going. You're in this odd sort of like perpetual in-betweenness. And what do you do there? You pass the time. You're just trying to get past this moment. And Sennett says, what if this is a primary metaphor for what life looks like living in the 21st century? That we're all just waiting for what's next. We've severed our ties with what is behind us, and we're super, super hopeful about what is to come, but it's not here yet. And in the meantime, we're living in this in-between. And we no longer think that where we live or where we work or our friendships or our relationships or our marriages, just because they're a part of our life now doesn't mean they'll be a part of our life in the future. Why should they? We're always on to whatever is next, whatever is coming. We want to leave the world behind and go find something new. Generations before us didn't use terms like starter homes. You just bought a home, and then you put down roots in your community because it meant something negative if you left. Why would you? But for us, every decision we make is only one step in a process that leads us somewhere else. There's a book by Alan Briggs called Staying is the New Going, where he makes the case to Christians that God has placed you where you are for a reason, that maybe you need to put roots down where you are right now for a reason. Everyone's obsessed with going somewhere else. We're obsessed with tourism. We're obsessed with exploring the world. But what if God just wants you to anchor yourself right where you are? We've lost our sense of belonging because we're always on to whatever is coming next. There is a film called Up in the Air with George Clooney from maybe 8 or 9 years ago, where he is a corporate HR executive whose role it is to sever the relationships between the company and the employees. Do you understand what I mean there? And he loves his job. He travels all over the world. He lives in airports and in hotels and out of a suitcase, and he thinks it's the best thing ever. He absolutely loves it. He goes around to hotels and he gives seminars with a backpack, and he says, everything I need for the rest of my life is on my back right now. I don't need other people. I don't need other places. I just need to be in perpetual motion, always traveling. But then he meets a woman who is sort of doing the same thing in a hotel bar, and they develop a relationship. And it's a shallow relationship. It's mostly a physical relationship, but he doesn't know anything about relationships. So he mistakes it for a genuine relationship. And he starts getting closer to this woman only to realize later on that she's actually married. And she has a family, and she has children, and this is like something she does when she travels for fun. And he's deeply, deeply wounded by it. It was his one chance to like engage in relationships, and now he decides he's going to pull back, and he's going to live even more into that life that is up in the air, right? Just flying over the world below. Down there, everyone's living their lives. I'm just flying over top of it. And that's one of the ways that we're living in our lives. We're socially dislocated. We don't know our neighbors anymore. We don't know the people on our streets anymore. We're losing that like social connection that God intends for us to be experiencing. We're disembodied, We're dislocated, and most of us are carrying around a device in our pockets that keeps us disengaged from what's happening in the world around us. And this is the third thing that Frost said. He said, we're emotionally disengaged. We're all living with a pretty severe case of digital addiction. Our addiction to screens was inevitable. We began to outsource knowing from our bodies to our minds, and now what's happened? We've outsourced knowing from our minds to the internet, to Google, to Siri, to Alexa. Whoever it is, we no longer need to know things, We just have to ask the internet. We're entirely disengaged from the world around us, and we're experiencing life through a screen. But the effect is not only cognitive, it's also emotional. Social media platforms were designed by the same people who designed slot machines in casinos. They're intended to give you a false reward system in your brain. Every time you get a notification or a like or a message, every time you see one of those like colorful red dots in the color or on the background of a blue and white page, your brain like shoots a burst of dopamine and says, you're doing good, you're doing good, you're doing good, you're doing good, you're doing good. It's a reward system. It's counterfeit, but we don't always know that. Up until a few years ago on Instagram, until you got your 11th like, the likes were just displayed by the name of the person who liked it. So you'd have a row of like, whoever it is, different people that follow you would like it. But the moment you got your 11th like, it shifted from names to numbers. It was like one of the 10 phrases of the year in 2019 because of what it was doing psychologically to us. When we saw the 11th like, our brains, boom, shot a dopamine that says you did it. This is a good post. You did well, right? Look at this tweet. This girl, Andy Brody 8, said, this might be weird, but I like when I'm someone's 11th like on Instagram because I'm the one who turned the names into numbers. We're losing our sense of who we are. We're becoming emotionally disengaged. Outsourcing our thinking is quickly taking control of our passions as well, especially when it comes to screens. And of course, the most disturbing example is online pornography. Is there anything more excarnate, more disembodied than it, like satisfying your sexual needs through a virtual experience that happens behind a screen? In his novel, The Lost Memory of Skin, Russell Banks tells the story of a young man who sits in his room in his apartment with his computer and his pet iguana on his lap. And hour after hour, day after day, he consumes every bit of online pornography that he can find. He's seen every encounter, every possible sexual encounter between a man and a woman, and yet he's a virgin, and he knows only the touch of his own skin, the touch of his iguana's skin. He's terribly depressed as a result. We are living these lives where we're separated, we're disengaged from our emotions even. In Romans 12, Paul says, the day will come when you will be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But what does it look like to have a renewed mind? How does something like that happen? Again, please don't mishear me. I tried to say at the beginning, and I'll say it again here. There are plenty of mental health conditions that require the help of mental health professionals. And I'm so grateful that those things are in place. But if we are living in direct opposition to the life that God designed us to live, can we be at all surprised that our mental health is collapsing? Of course it is. There is a force at work in the world that is drawing us out of our bodies, and it is separating us from one another. It is exchanging human touch for excarnate, virtual, screen-addicted experiences. We are living in a gate lounge, and we wonder why our mental health is crumbling. We wonder why we're dying inside. This way of living is entirely contrary to how God has designed us to live. This is not who you are supposed to be. In his book, The Magnificent Defeat, Frederick Buechner shares some thoughts on the parable of Christ the tiger. Now the parable of the tiger. The parable of the tiger is actually a 19th century Hindi parable that goes something like this. There once was a mother tiger who was moments away from giving birth, and she's stalking a pack of goats. Knowing that she's eating for two and aware that this may be her last full meal before she gives birth, she gets desperate and she lunges at one of the goats. But she's clumsy because of her large belly. And when she does, she loses her balance, falls to the ground, and strikes her head on a rock, killing her instantly. And a couple moments later, a small tiger cub is born. Well, the goats that were nearby gather around this small cub, and they begin to raise the cub as if he was one of their own. The motherless tiger is taught to eat grass. He's taught to bleat with the herd. He's taught to live as a goat, and in the end, fully believing himself to, in fact, be a goat. But then one day, an adult Bengal tiger starts sauntering through the jungle. And when the herd of goats see it, they quickly disperse and run away, leaving just this wannabe goat standing there to confront the king tiger. The adult tiger comes up on the cub and he looks down at him in astonishment. And he says, "What are you doing here?" And the young cub says, "Ma." And he says, "We do not bleat." And the young cub gets nervous and he starts eating some grass. "And we do not eat grass. We are not vegetarians." He reaches down and picks the cub up by the back of his neck and carries it over to a nearby pool of water so that he can see their reflections side by side and kind of reach his own conclusions. Still nothing. Finally, he brings him a piece of raw meat. And the cub starts biting and eating, nervously at first, then more comfortably. And he slowly starts to feel like the warmth, the warm blood rushing through his body. And reality sets in. And he lashes his tail and he lifts his head to the sky. And the whole jungle quakes at the sound of his roar. We are not who we are supposed to be as humans. The goat is not a goat. The goat is a tiger. But the goat doesn't know he's a tiger. And until he does, he is a goat. Or at least something other than a tiger. This is the story of humanity. We were all created in the image of the God of the universe, but that has been broken, that has been lost. And we're all kind of scrambling around taking on these other identities, the identities that are surrounding us. And every once in a while, we catch our reflection in the water, and we're reminded that we are not who we should be. Maybe if we could convince ourselves that we really were goats, it wouldn't be a problem. But there's just enough of that tiger DNA left inside of us. And no matter how much grass we eat, our bellies are never filled. And no matter how much we bleat, we cannot find our voice. Deep down, we are fully aware that we were made for roaring. One of the ways we try to cope with this is to distract ourselves. We watch reruns of The Office, or we scroll through social media. We try out a new craft beer. We try out new hobbies or new lovers or new belief systems, but the problem won't go away. And Fred Buechner says this: "To anyone who is looking for good reasons not to be a Christian, I can suggest none better than that to be a Christian is only to make the problem worse. Because a Christian is one who has seen the tiger." And either we must crucify the tiger to escape its haunting reminder, or we must risk the death of our goathood. But the two cannot remain. And if Jesus is what it looks like to be fully human, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, then what am I? And what kind of life am I living? The Jesus that we encounter in the Gospels is not the sunken-eyed, pale-skinned monarch of British literature. And he is not the bushy-bearded, take it or leave it, cool kid socialist of hipster culture. He is ferocious. He is bold, and he is brave, and he is humble, and he is gentle. And he reminds us that we are made to be also. In John chapter 1, when John wants to tell the story of how Jesus was born, he says, the Word, the Logos, Jesus, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus leaves the heaven and comes down and takes on flesh. He incarnates. And then he locates himself in the region of Galilee, his hometown, where he grew up. Not where he was born, but where he lived. And he rarely travels more than a few miles away for the rest of his life. He orders his entire existence around the worship of God. And part of worshiping God for him is finding ways to serve others. And so he heals, and he feeds, and he visits, and he speaks. When he's tired, he rests. We should do that. When he's hungry, he eats. We should do that. And when the world around him starts to feel a little too overwhelming, when he is anxious or discouraged or uncertain, he retreats from the noise and he finds a solitary place and he prays. And we should do that too. He never loses sight of his mission. And he tells us that we are made to be like him. I don't expect the world that we live in is going to get any easier anytime soon. I don't get the sense that whatever it is that's causing our anxiety and depression is likely to dissipate in the next 20 years. There's a very real chance it's going to get worse. That was certainly his story. Life kept moving him into more and more difficult situations. But he taught us how to anchor ourselves physically and emotionally and spiritually and mentally in the faith that God is in control. And he doesn't just show us, he tells us that if we're willing to die to ourselves, he can do the same thing in us. Frederick Buechner, one more time. To anyone who is looking for good reasons for being a Christian, let me suggest the only good one I know, that in this man there is power to turn goats into tigers, to give life to the half alive, and even to the dead. Paul says it like this: but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Whatever it is that Jesus is demonstrating, he is offering to do in our lives, if we are willing to submit to him. Whatever you have been, whatever you have done, whatever your past looks like, Jesus shows us a new way to be fully human. And then he provides the power to make it happen. He trades beauty for ashes. He trades strength for mourning. He trades a garment of praise for a spirit of despair. Let's pray. God, thank you for the example of your Son and the way that we are reminded, sometimes in discomfortable ways, of what we are created to be, what it looks like to be fully human. And God, in the midst of the distance between us and who you want us to be, would you give us the courage to surrender our lives to you, to let go of our goathood, so that you can make us into the people you've created us to be. God, help us live incarnated, intentionally located, engaged lives in our world. And may we see the fruits of living in the way of Jesus. May you transform our minds as we live out the way of your Son. In Jesus' name, amen.